and why them, basically. So my name is Maurice Otieno, Executive Director at Baraza Media Lab. Basically, we're a platform that empowers sort of like new storytelling ideas for media, and also trying to offer a space where they can try out their new business models, especially focusing on sustainability and also a bias to public interest media specifically. But today, the reason why we have this conversation today is stemming off what we saw in Nigeria, where there's a Twitter ban. But before that, there's been a lot of either total internet shutdowns or partial sort of like social media bans within various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And this raised concern to us in terms of very many issues around media independence, rights to information. And we wanted to just convene this conversation to start seeding that idea of when this happens, how do we prepare ourselves, or even what are the risks that we face? So that's why we are here. And today we are blessed really to have Sigi Mwanzia from Article 19, Nanjira Sambuli, Policy and Governance Advisor, and John Allen. So I'll start with Sigi to just introduce yourself best, then Nanjira, then John.
Thank you, Maurice. Your introduction was fantastic. To everybody, my name is Sigi. I'm a digital program officer at Article 19 Eastern Africa, and we work on all matters digital rights. Very excited to be part of this conversation.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Nanjira, as you heard. Simply put, I follow the politics of tech. So without much further ado, we'll see what that means in the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Allen. I'm an investigative journalist and the co-founder of Africa Uncensored. And thanks a lot for inviting me, Maurice and everyone.
Good. Thanks. Thanks, John. Without further ado, we'll just go right into it because it's an interesting conversation. And today my role is just to play like, I don't know if you can call it question jockeys. I'll be moving questions from one player to the other, but they'll also ask themselves each other questions. So we also encourage you as participants to ask any questions that you have. But for now, I want to just move directly to Sigi. Why should we even care about this right now? Specifically for us as Kenyans, right? Like right now, why should we get worried about internet and social media shutdowns?
Thank you very much, Maurice. That is a pertinent question. Now, what we've been seeing across the world, and I don't mean to be the harbinger of terrible news, is this increased trend towards the regulation of content, the regulation of platforms by governments, and this battle between governments and social media platforms. And oftentimes, we, the users, are the ones who end up getting caught in that crossfire. Now, we've been seeing this not just on the African continent, but globally. And so there's a global trend towards the imposition of restrictions on the platforms that we use to be able to express our rights, to be able to access information, to be able to organize protests, amongst others. Now, what we've been seeing across the world, because we work on human rights, one of the calls and arguments that we have been putting forward is that governments must comply with the three-part test under international law, and essentially comply with the international obligations. But what we've been seeing governments doing, including governments in Kenya, is that they are meeting the quote-unquote legality arm. The constitutionality of some of these provisions is a different question, but they're also failing on the proportionality and the necessity fronts, because the laws that they're imposing must satisfy and must be aligned with constitutional provisions and must give life rather than unduly restricting some of the rights, for example, to freedom of expression. I'll speak to some of the concerns and some of the reasons why we as Kenyans should be concerned. Recently we saw Honorable Aden Duale introducing amendments to the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act in a bill that has now been tabled before Parliament, before the National Assembly. Honorable Aden Duale and other speakers such as Francis Atwoli have been coming out very strongly on the pornography provisions, which are in and of themselves very problematic. But what they haven't been disclosing to the general public is that in these amendments is a proposal to empower the Cybercrimes Committee with powers to quote, give recommendations, which would essentially render websites inaccessible in Kenya. One of the questions we are asking is, does a kind of one, what is the legality of these particular provisions? Two is, just in line with some of the conversations and some of the issues that we've been seeing happening on the regional and international fronts is that government cannot essentially come out strongly and proclaim that they will be disrupting access to communication platforms, including websites. And international mechanisms have come out quite strongly on the illegality and the unconstitutionality of some of these proposed recommendations, even where governments are invoking, shutdowns on grounds of national security or grounds of public order. And so, we are waiting for responses from Honorable Aden Duale. We are attempting to communicate with him in his office. But also some of the other questions that are being asked is, what kind of websites will be shut down? Who will be responsible for implementing and enforcing the recommendations that are coming from this particular committee? I think one other point that I'd like to flag out before stopping my very extensive monologue is to point out that just before the 2017 elections, the Communications Authority came out strongly and stated that they have a monitoring tool and tools to be able to, quote, disrupt our access to the internet. Now, whether this mechanism exists, whether it has been deployed before, we don't know. But if we refer to the government's ability to shut down TV stations and not comply with court orders, even where they've been told to reinstate those signals, if we take some of these historical, what do I call them? Historical trends and historical habits, then these are some of the reasons why we should be concerned, and also noting some of the patterns and incidents that are happening in other countries, including Nigeria. Proposals that are coming out from countries such as Mauritius, where they are stating, we're trying to talk to some of these platforms, and they're not listening to us. So we are going to create legislation that enables us to be able to essentially put on and put off the access switch. So very, very concerning trends happening on the continent, even in countries such as Uganda, Tanzania, in the build-up to, during, and after their elections. So very problematic trends that we're seeing on the continent that we hope our government will not pick up, and we just hope we won't see these bad manners being enforced by our own governments. But just building off of some of these trends, these are some of the challenges that we should be prepared for and should be attempting to find solutions to, so that we're not reacting, we are responding to some of these challenges before they actually take place. Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you, Sigi, for the comprehensive sort of look at the vulnerabilities that we are looking at. And I like the point that you talked about the government's relying a lot on the legality of some of these issues, but not really the constitutionality part of it. And for me, that with the recent bills that are contentious and still in discussions, I'd like to rope in now, John, in terms of are you worried? Are you worried as an independent journalist and independent media? Are you worried with some of the trends that you're seeing, basically from a legal perspective?
Yeah, for sure, I'm worried, because what it essentially means is that if Africa Uncensored or any other platform that relies on people being able to access it digitally or on the internet, if we were to publish something that someone with the powers to be able to switch us off doesn't like, then they could very well do that and would have no recourse. We do not have currently the capacity to be able to open our own television station, and even if we did, the same sort of actions would be taken against us. I think for me, one of the things that perhaps very weirdly might be a saving grace for Kenya is the reliance of people within government and outside of government, power brokers within and outside of government, on the very space that other countries are trying to curtail, to be able to spread misinformation and disinformation about their political opponents. We've seen that being used to great effect here almost on a daily basis, right? So for instance, Africa Uncensored published a report about keyboard warriors, showing that there are specific, targeted nerve centers of people who operate within the digital space that are focused on specific political figures, William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta. Why that might be important in the lead up, at least to the election and going forward, is that they need that kind of space to be able to, cultivate some sort of influence. What is dangerous, however, is in my view, the fact that, and this relates, to the politics of the country, but also to the access to information and the discussion that we're having right now. What worries me extensively is the fact that we have an incumbent who is very, very interested in the outcome of the next election, meaning that we have a highly contested environment, and therefore the availability of an option like this, is something that can be used to be able to exert state power. And we don't need to look very far back into our history to see what the outcome of things like that could be. 2007, we have the Internal Security Minister switching off live broadcasts or banning live broadcasts for a specific period of time. Looking at what's happened in India, which I think has had the highest number of internet shutdowns in recent past. Anytime there's an internet shutdown, especially with regard to some sort of political incident, it starves the public of credible sources of information, and increases the likelihood that people could fall for fake news and misinformation, and also increases the likelihood of violence and the intensity of that violence because of the lack, the vacuum in terms of that information. So, like Ziggy, it's a very worrying future that we're kind of stepping into with these amendments that are being proposed, but more widely with what's happening across the continent. I think the final thing I will say is it's not just about the shutting down of the internet. It's about the use of that privilege that will then be afforded to one channel to be able to create its own spin, its own narratives around what's happening. We saw this happening in Uganda. A lot of the disinformation and misinformation in the lead up to that election this year was coming from the government itself, and that's been proven. So those are the kinds of things that we are looking at contending with in the near future, Maurice.
Yeah, I mean, just to rope you back, to bring in Nigeria into the conversation in terms of just having a lot of power in one organization to determine who speaks, who doesn't, right? And for us, I'd like to bring the angle of governance. Like, how does that even give any sense of legitimacy to, let's say, future governments, especially as we are heading into elections, which is next year? Do you foresee a risk of, if this happens, what might be the impact from the international community? That's the first question, in terms of Kenya shutting down its internet, but also to just bring you down to now a specific question that I wanted to bring into your sort of like a view is: are these internet shutdowns even effective? Are they even effective based on what you've seen outside there and during your work?
So the legitimacy question is an interesting one, and I think it speaks to some of the legal aspects that Siggy was alluding to: necessity, proportionality, international law, and all of that. The problem we have in the state of the world today is that any government that comes under sort of any critique from the international community for certain acts can easily invoke the whole mind your own business, for lack of a better framing. And specifically with the laws around tech governance, there's this notion of asserting sovereignty in cyberspace. We see especially Russia and China being big proponents of that in the international community around how international law applies to cyberspace. So that's just the technical aspect, but really what it is a cover for the siyasa, the politics that they want to, not have anybody involved in. And the biggest strand that we must never lose sight of that is affected through the technical aspects like these, legal aspects, is information flow. Living in an information age for somebody who's insecure is a very dangerous thing, because on one hand, they, as John Allen was saying, they want information, their information as they determine, to flow. At the same time, they want to stop other information from flowing, but it's a game of whack-a-mole. So it's what we're seeing with these tools like shutdowns, or even national security laws are very much being amended in many countries, including ours, to be invoked in case of anything. National security as a last resort is something that many other governments, even those who would typically be like, oh, freedoms, could understand, because they too are likely to invoke the same. So these are just the politics of who wants to control what information is in the hands of which people, and conversely, who gets to or doesn't get to at what time to do it. But the world has shifted too. I mean, even politics are being challenged in that way. And that's why we're seeing a lot more of these measures, which we should really interpret as powers and power holders in trying to find their way of operating that worked in the past for the tools of the present. And so like in Kenya, for me, I'm more inclined to think that it's not necessarily like a full-scale shutdown as we've seen amongst our neighbors that would happen. You might have targeted sites suddenly being inaccessible, or that kind of thing. But more interestingly is actually what John Allen was talking about, just being flooded with such nonsense that you don't know what to trust, just so bombarded, and we already see that it's become part of our media diet. So you can have a huge populace that is on such an unhealthy information diet that getting everybody to speak from the same hymn book would be, or sing from the same hymn book as an electorate would be impossible. So those are the more kind of tactics, alongside with surveillance and sort of like people getting random phone calls in the middle of the night saying we're watching what you're saying, kind of thing that I would expect as a shutdown, where we are being forced to censor ourselves. Because it would just be a bit too tricky to just shut it all down, because so much of our economy too runs on these very platforms. And I think for the government of Kenya, that's the saddest thing, that those who would like things to work a la Nigeria or otherwise. And the last thing we must remember from Nigeria is actually not even so much about banning Twitter, as it is a bigger conversation about how these platforms can be held accountable to national laws. Because at the end of the day, they want Twitter to come to the table to register locally in Nigeria. A lot of countries, especially outside of the West, are very interested in that. The international conversations happening on taxing these multinationals tend to still favor the perspectives of the West and have not considered these of the developing countries. So India and Nigeria are big markets that could really assert some laws that require these platforms to do that. But it's also tricky for the platforms, because if they register in Nigeria, tomorrow Kenya will call, Uganda will call, and so on and so forth. So these are really interesting dances that show that all of this is also, the technical is just as political as we understand politics.
Yeah, and you mentioned about sort of like how in Kenya it might be a bit difficult, because most of our operations or operandi like depend on the internet, right? So for me, it's just the question is like, how do these sort of like even commercial organizations, how do they take part to just safeguard that from happening? And really anyone can answer this. It's not. I'm just piggybacking on what Najira was talking about. And especially when it comes to things like policy and laws, and the first thing that you hear most, let's say, politicians saying is, oh, public participation, right? If you want to change something, participate publicly. But you see what happened, let's say, with BBI, for example, where they said there was public participation, and the little that was there, then the document comes back and it's totally different from what you had agreed. So it's almost like it's a endless cycle of just frustration, where even if I try to participate, even what I give is not recognized. So how do people come up, and how do organizations who stand a lot to lose, especially if there's internet or social media shutdown, how do they prepare themselves for this type of engagements? Or what should they do? So that's my question that I throw to anyone within the panel, basically.
I have a one sentence answer on this one, because it's really simple. All these things are by design. Okay. It's frustration by design. It's frustration because a few people would much rather have power and have all these democratic instruments as farces. And for all of us, regardless of which sphere or domain we focus on, seeing these interlinkages is the thing that will complicate what this consolidation of power for perverse means is. Because whether you look at it from how our national security laws, for example, have been amended over time, or even the fact that we have a curfew that till today, all these years later, we've not, it really does feel like years, we have not been, and what's the necessity, proportionality, legality aspect of it? And are we even sure we'll be able to have it lifted? Because once they get an inch, they take a mile kind of thing. It's the same way when you think about our data protection bill. When the president announced assenting to it, it was co-announced alongside Amazon establishing its presence here. That gave us a signal that this was more about compliance. We had been going through the process of the bill, public participation and all of that for 7 years. And what we ended up with had been so peppered with GDPR-esque compliance matters so that it just ticks the boxes for the people who are more likely to engage the government on the things that are convenient for them and not so much for us as citizens. And so these are the trends that we see. And for most folks, especially those in the tech sector, I would say do not even ever think for a second that that sphere is not subject to the same politics that you see happening in sectors like media or otherwise. In fact, it's even doubling down more because tech can come in for just communication, go into health, go into ID systems as we're seeing. So following that political strand is something that every citizen should apprise themselves with and get very familiar with.
Okay. Anyone wants to add anything? Sigi, John?
Yeah, okay, I don't know whether it means the same thing that I think it does, but the concept of conscious capitalism in a sense is what I'd expect of businesses, of industry, when it comes to looking at these kinds of laws. So what I believe that to be is a sort of business environment and players within that environment who see the entire economy and the entire as being interlinked with the socio-economic and political developments in a country, and therefore not seeing themselves as separate from them and negotiating only for bottom line outcomes, but also for outcomes that benefit their buyers, benefit the people who shop or go to hospital in their hospitals. To begin to see that in that sense, it will create a sort of lobby that can then, at least at some level, counter some of the influences as Nigeria was talking about from some of these FANG, from some of these FANG and FANG-like organizations. That locally, at least, there is an infrastructure where the voices of local companies, local organizations, well, be they small or be they big, have some sort of seat at the table when discussing things that are as important as these laws. That's how business gets involved, by not seeing itself as separate from the rest of the society. And a great example of this is the kind of backlash that KEPSA received in the wake of the second lockdown this year, because in some quarters it was believed that they were only speaking with regard to their own interests and very, very limited interests at that. And as long as they are seen as separate from the rest of society, then they will be victimized by the rest of society, when that time or if that time were to come.
Maurice, if I can chime in to this conversation about viewing, this conversation about viewing, looking at entities and stakeholders as a not competing, what's the word? Entities that stakeholders who co-facilitate each other. I think one of the challenges that we have been seeing from private sector players, even as we're talking about them participating in processes, is building on some of the issues that we've seen that Nigeria had raised about them co-opting the process, or the processes essentially being led predominantly by business interests rather than by other interests is a core challenge. But I think also this complicity of private entities also needs to be challenged, right? And it is being challenged. One of the things that we have been seeing in countries like Uganda and Tanzania was corporates refusing to acknowledge that they have a responsibility whether they like it or not, to human rights, right? And so one of the calls that we have been seeing coming out increasingly to entities like Ethio Telecom just before the elections in Ethiopia that are supposed to take place this month, and some of the requests that went out to private sector and telecommunications operators in Uganda and Tanzania was stop complying with these requests to disrupt access. But they aren't. They comply with these requests. Sometimes they don't even disclose that they've complied with these requests, which is a major challenge. They don't disclose that they've complied with these requests in their transparency reporting, which is also another challenge. So yeah, just a constant reminder to corporates that they themselves have responsibilities to protect and respect human rights. I think one of the fundamental or foundational cases that came out from countries like Sudan was stakeholders, we ourselves as users, recognizing that we don't always have to attack government. Sometimes we can attack corporate entities themselves for failing to uphold their end of the bargain. And we've seen this in countries like Sudan. So I believe that a few telecommunications operators were taken to court by, I can't remember the name of the case. And that particular individual succeeded. The courts agreed with the arguments that were being made, and the telco company acknowledged its responsibilities. So yeah, just accepting that corporates have a role to play in the ecosystem. And that complicity should not be their standpoint as and when they are engaging with governments. They can push back. And we have seen entities in, I believe it was countries like Liberia, pushing back against requests to disrupt access. Yeah.
Before we logged on to start the conversation, John had asked a question. And one of the questions was just to expound on the data commissioner's role and where are some of these laws that are being put in place or the bill, where are they borrowing from, basically? For this one, I'll rope in Sigi, and then I know Nigeria might want to chime in and add a thing or two. So go ahead, Sigi, if you have any answer to John's question.
If you don't mind repeating the question, maybe I can frame a better response to that. Maybe John Allen can ask the.
Yeah, exactly. John just asked. Sorry.
So I was looking at the role of the data commission, and I wondered to myself what, if any, role it has that's separate from the Ministry of Information, who has the power to be able to check who, for instance, what we're being faced in the next year. So that those were really my thoughts. And then secondly, where are we borrowing some of the powers that we're getting?
Okay, maybe I can try a preliminary response to that question. I think I'll start with the latter question. So where are we borrowing and why are we borrowing? I believe when the task force on data protection was crafting the data protection bill and the policy, as Nigeria had stated, they relied very heavily, just based off of some of the conversations I've had with some members in the task force, on the GDPR, right? It was used as a benchmarking tool. But they also had conversations with other stakeholders from countries such as South Africa, relying on POPIA, countries like Ghana. But we know that a lot of these laws borrow quite heavily from these so-called quote-unquote international standards. The Council of Europe's Data Protection Unit pushed quite heavily for the government to incorporate some of the protections in the COE Convention 108 and make sure that some of those protections appeared in our Data Protection Act. Now, while benchmarking is a useful exercise, these laws must be contextualized, right, to be able to cater to the interests, the needs, and the challenges that are being faced within the Kenyan ecosystem. Now, how far this was accomplished, we do not know, because the research that task force had conducted was never released out into the public. And this is still a core challenge that we face in our country, right? Not a lot of baseline research goes into processes before we move to the legislative process. And even where that baseline research exists, we don't make reference to those documents as we are crafting and preparing our legislative responses. And the question is why? Because some of these documents have several solutions, several answers to the problems that we are facing that might be more appropriate towards dealing with, as I mentioned, our contextual challenges. So very big question mark around that. We are not saying we should not adopt some of the standards and principles and policies, etc., that are coming from other jurisdictions. But we do need them to be contextualized to be able to address our problems in an appropriate manner. Moving to the question on the Data Protections Office, I think it's important to look at these regulators from a very wide perspective. So when we're not just looking at the Data Protection Commissioner's Office, we're also looking at the role that the Communications Authority plays. We're looking at the role that the Ministry of Interior plays. And as we're discussing earlier, looking also at the role that the Commissioner on Administrative Justice plays, because all these entities are tasked with promoting not just rights, but also ensuring that we become continuously immersed in the digital economy. Now, I think that the question that you had asked was, what is the role of the Data Commissioner in this shutdowns conversation? Now, I'm just breezing through some of the functions of the office. And some of the issues and things that it's supposed to deal with is, one is registration of data controllers and processors, some of whom happen to be telecommunications operators, who happen to be internet service providers, who are very integral to this connectivity conversation, to access and accessibility conversation. And so they do play a role within this particular ecosystem. I think I'll stop there as I think of other comments to chime in. Yeah.
Frankly, the best thing the Data Commissioner can do for us is stop the pop-ups, as in basic stuff. Stick to the technical, simple things and secure some wins, because the entire thing, the budgets that will be allocated as you've established, is going through the executive, which will want to enforce controls. And not too many were happy that the Communications Authority is quite independent, and that is why the Office of the Data Protection Commission has been structured. All these elements are by design. But yeah, if they can stick to those little things that actually make the systems that we have that are digitizing our entire lives compliant, that would be a start. The bigger issues to the meta question about where we're borrowing from is that the saddest thing is that we're not borrowing from one of the best instruments we've ever had on an African level, which is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And why that document is quite seminal is it's perhaps one of the only charters on human rights that considers the individual as part of a collective. Right now, we have a huge challenge, even with GDPR, which focuses so much on an individual, but forgets that the data and what enriches data as is being processed around an individual is being mixed. So our data together is of more value to whoever is a data holder than my data individually, because they can mix and match from different sources and create inferences about who we are, what we're about, and that kind of thing. And that's where the theater is that limits what GDPR, which has become sort of like the gold standard in the world today, can handle. But you go back to something like the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Ideally, it would have been a living document that is being updated, because some of its stipulations are a bit from the 60s, to be honest. But that whole idea of you think about the individual within a community and a society, I imagine would have had really interesting data protection laws in our regions that would have been benchmarks for the world too. What we are seeing now that people are realizing, and especially based on the US experience of how and which kinds of communities are being affected by this adverse data collection, is that we have to, it's a perverse thing where we have to wait till it happens to the West for it to be understood. We're like, we've been new, it's been here, we have the instruments, we've thought about this, our ancestors have thought about this. What is this discontinuity that we always think that we have to go and borrow? And that's the challenge, against this backdrop of, fine, we can't start saying we'll create our own tech. Some people will try, it's great if they can, but we're living in this reality and present. How do we actually make sure that whatever comes into our space works within our ways and our norms is really something that we should be upholding, and having a few more institutions, including NGOs, including corporate players, and including our governments, depending on what will give us legitimate governments going forward, should be concerning themselves with. So it's really just to show that it's not that we don't have. I mean, this notion that Africa lacks is the biggest lie. The challenge is that there's too many short-term interests that have sort of discontinued a long-term thinking, but we also have the opportunity, thankfully and ironically, to the internet age and the information age, to piece these things together and start thinking about alternative frames, or how to even just reform what we already have, because we can't know really for everything. It's a bit too late for that.
Thanks, Nanjira, for that context. I'd like to invite sort of like the participants to just share a couple of questions. I see one question that has already come in. We'll leave a lot of time for questions. And basically, because this is a conversation that we are doing, we didn't want to make it very formal, like a panel or something, but we wanted it to just set the ground for those important questions to be asked from the audience. So if you have any question, please use the Q&A functionality to ask a question there. But I would like to now have about 10 to 15 minutes, actually 10 minutes, of just thinking of like, what do you think is, what are some of the major trends that we probably in Kenya specifically will see in relation to this topic in the next 1 year? What are some of those things that you think could be something that we need to start thinking about based on sort of like what you're seeing across the world in different sectors?
The taxing and licensing bit is one that could very actively, given that we're going towards an election season, you might see a situation where a popular platform, and really at this point, we're looking at either Twitter or WhatsApp, i.e. Facebook as a company, being, the government trying to get them to come to the table more, either make promises to register here. There's something around licensing and taxing. Now, I think the Kenyan government, in as much as it's tax hungry to increase its tax revenue, knows that the way Uganda went about it is not the way to go. So you're not just going to suddenly see, although we kind of have it, these low taxes that come as excise duty and whatever, but this social media tax as a concept wouldn't be how they go. It will be interesting to see how they try and bring these companies to the table to have some jurisdictional sort of like, administrative elements to it. I mean, it used to seem like they tried to get them to register here as Africa HQ, but if they can't get Konza done or whatever else was going to lure them in, they have to find something else. Is it number of users? Is it, revenue as they project? So that's going to be a really interesting one. Given just the fact that the government is tax hungry and the political season is picking up.
Maybe I can jump in next, kind of building on what Nanjira had stated. I think what we will be, so two trends. One is, as Nanjira had pointed out, attempts to try and localize some of these platforms within our jurisdiction. I apologize for the background noise. We had seen attempts by private members to introduce, amendments to the KICA Act and proposals to localize, quote unquote, some of these entities within the Kenyan jurisdiction. It is highly likely that this conversation will be instated, either through, as Nanjira said, through the taxation and licensing arm, or through threats of, if you don't register, we will quote unquote switch off access to your platforms. I was having a conversation with Odanga, who is actually on the call from Odipo Dev, and one of the comments he made was, what is actually the sustainability of these platforms, given the political situation that is happening across the Eastern Africa region? Are these platforms actually sustainable in the long run for us on the African continent? Or do we need to start creating homegrown solutions for us to be, that essentially tackle some of the challenges that we're seeing between these big tech companies and the tensions that we're seeing between the big tech companies, and our own government. So I think that is a conversation that we need to start having right now. Yeah.
It's interesting that Odanga mentions, what homegrown solutions might exist. I think I've seen one or two, and I've been called by one or two other people who are looking at this actually from the point of view of business and what kind of platforms they can create locally that can bring people into the fold. I think though that the trends that we're going to see in the next year are some that we've seen before. As Nanjira mentioned, we're going to be choked with an environment of a news and information environment that's highly toxic and very, very difficult to depend on and not trustworthy. I think the second thing that we'll see perhaps closer to the election is the securitization of some of these spaces. That in as much as these and specifically for the politics, these political players depend on this space to be able to proliferate some of their content. There is a thinking and there are moves that I'm privy to that will likely get us closer and closer to the Ugandan model of what will happen in the lead up to the election. I'm not sure about the election itself. And I say this not so much because we're going in that direction, but because of the lack of preparedness of some of our institutions to be able to handle an election of the magnitude that we are facing. And you can see, some of the offhand comments that are being made by people like, Francis Atwoli about having a referendum before an election, and if not, then we postpone the election. And that sort of political conversation starting to pick up. It can only pick up in the absence of voices or narratives that then counter. And the closer you get to an election or the closer you get to a political event like that, then the greater the temptation to be able to use these things.
Yeah. And do you think from a independent, because I would like to presume that most of sort of like the platforms that are offering alternative voices are your independent media and of course social media, right? Do you think from that front, okay, KOT has always been active, right? But do you think from an independent media perspective, do we have sort of like the skin and the gas to run through some of this barrage of noise that will be coming from the machinery to just confuse us? Do you think we are there yet to be able to offer that alternative sort of like thought process and thinking?
I think we definitely have the skill and the intellect to be able to do so. What we lack is a solidarity. And that's something that's a much, much bigger conversation, because how do you then create solidarity within disparate voices and get them to see the same thing at the same time? And that's, like the big question about the internet. How then do you build communities that can challenge power in a sustainable way and that are not influenced in some way by it, right? So from my point of view, what is lacking is the solidarity to be able to build these kinds of communities. But for sure, we have the right kind of mix of skills and not just skills, the right numbers. I think we have a good critical mass of people who use the internet to the effect that it could be very, very impactful in coming days. But how do you get these people to see the same thing at the same time?
And also, the organizing, even if it's just of small constituencies, that has to be both online and offline. The other thing that for sure is, I could speculate, and major is already happening, is when we're talking about stakeholders, you can have and we see strange bedfellows where you have the companies, and I think somebody in the chat was talking about it, with the government. Now, you can have a situation where a government has just laws or regulations that just allow sufficient compliance, say, to make sure that in the international community, everything looks like it's kosher, but either you stall by in enacting them. So Kenya has always historically been very good in having good laws on paper, but the enforcement is lacking. So in that gray space, you have a situation where governments and businesses can have a lot to gain from collecting as much data about us as possible. And these platforms have a lot to gain by trying to make sure that they can sell to advertisers more contextualized spaces to sell ads to us. And through that process of allowing wanton data collection, you could find a situation where the government, as one of the biggest spenders, could infiltrate, because these other algorithms are being curated based on, we are more online, yes, we're generating, we're tweeting, we're doing this, but we're sharpening the tools that then will be used to divide us. So keeping a link of understanding that the same way we can be tear gassed offline, there are online equivalents, so that we're always aware of what's happening, because that's a real situation. These companies will want to make sure they can sell the local advertisers as on point data frames as possible. So through that, they could be that avenue that benefits both of them to our detriment. So we also need to sharpen our sort of like our organizing toolkit, our civic corpus, to understand that it's not the online versus offline. It's not that one is better than the other. We need to find a clever mix of both, because on both fronts, we are under attack. We are under siege, truly speaking.
I like that analogy, online tear gassing. Sigi, last question. There's just a random thought process that we started discussing about with, let's say, the internet shutdowns and social media bans that we're seeing across, which has been, the internet and social media has been a pain in terms of just reducing the revenue sources for mainstream media. Do you foresee a situation where mainstream media might be happy that now their revenue sources might grow because social media is not dependable going forward? I'll start with you then. I think this will be our last question, so I'll invite all of you also to just chime in. Then we welcome the questions and finish.
Thank you, Maurice. I think John Allen would be able to speak to the nuanced issues in this question. But what I don't think they would be pleased for several reasons. One is, when we were conducting a study in 2019 looking at some of this, the potential of social media platforms to operate quote unquote quality journalistic content. We had a lot of feedback from media houses and from journalists that they use these platforms to be able to disseminate their messages to people who, one, don't read newspapers, two, who don't watch news at 9 and 7 p.m. And so, no, I don't think that argument holds water, because these entities also use the internet. They use social media platforms, one, for purposes of revenue generation, two, for purposes of the dissemination of information that, and the expansion of their consumer base has also benefited quite greatly from some of these platforms. So I don't think it's as Nigeria was saying, it's not an online-offline conversation. It's not a mainstream media versus social media platform tension. It is a collective, holistic, collaborative ecosystem where each entity, each stakeholder benefits and profits from being able to access and to use these platforms.
We've come a long way with media, really. I was just reflecting on that from when bloggers was a matusi to where, we're seeing them set up. Oh God, we've come a long way. They don't have, I really think they don't believe that they have much to gain about, I don't know, advertisers going back to newspapers or whatever. They're having to adapt too. And so they're also adopting this environment we're in. What they could do that would be really interesting though. And, sometimes you advise them, but, if they don't want to listen, what can you do? Is set up your own platforms. Now, that's a difficult thing to tell John Allen to do, but where he can, he's better off doing it. That is your own website as much as what you can host by yourself, because then in the event that these other platforms will converge to a shutdown, John Allen would be still up to give us an update on what's happening. Those platforms that are not beholden to other. So this concept of sovereignty really, in terms of how much of your digital sovereignty you can have as an institution, is something that if media's fourth estate was a bit more serious, would be focusing on, rather than sending us Betika ads till at some point you're like, am I reading the news or is it just ads? That just shows you the short-term thinking to that, and this notion that they still are the ones on this pedestal and us guys are just the little ones who must be talked down to. So, they snooze, they lose. Things are changing. And if disruptive is disrupted is the message to them.
I don't know if there's anything else that I can say that can add to those comments. I don't think it benefits. I don't think it benefits them, and I'll be a bit philosophical here and say that, at least from the point of view of the public interest and access to information, you will find some of the greatest gatherings of people who believe in those concepts, in those laws, within the media itself. perhaps not at the level, or not at the executive level, but definitely within the rank and file, there are people who really believe in the importance of being able to sustain an environment where information flows freely, both online and offline. It doesn't help their bottom line, and if they've been watching the news, they'll know that some of these measures are short term. So you can't plan a business model around the kind of heavy-handed tactics that are being used across the continent, because eventually that same model is going to, it'll be lifted or it'll be turned on you. So it's a very, very short-term way of thinking.
Maurice, if I could continue contributing to that that point, that thread, Nigeria raised a very interesting point about alternative platforms, and it speaks to what John Allen had also mentioned earlier. This issue of the Communications Authority of Kenya being able to interfere with the signals of not one, not two, but 3 TV stations from being able to broadcast. And so, speaking to this issue of alternatives, these platforms do provide alternatives for media houses, for journalists, viable alternatives to facilitate the free flow of information. And so, to mitigate some of those interferences that they themselves may or may not have power and control over, platforms offer an alternative information facility. Let me stop. My English is now running out.
Marius, there's a question in the Q&A that I just wanted to give, because I think it's important to what we're trying to build towards. Sean had asked about the solidarity thing, and I just shortly typed about, I wanted to go back to the Huduma number registration drive, because that's a moment where we missed on solidarity, and just shows you how systems can really divide. The number of what is so-called middle-class people who ran to register, even when we'd been hearkening, and communities, especially like the Nubian Forum, had been telling folks, you let this thing happen based on our experience, kitaumana, it's going to go south. That for me is one missed opportunity, and shows us where we have work to do, because on one hand, as people maybe signal that, yeah, they get that it's unconstitutional and whatever, the number of people who were saying how they actually went, whether it's legitimately out of fear, or because the government for some reason used some charm offensive where they knock on people's doors and register them, you wonder why they're not doing that with the vaccine. That whole drive to collect that data, I mean, maybe we didn't have enough narratives to help people understand what was happening. That's the state's own way of amassing data, the same way these companies are. It could be anything to trade it in the data economy. It could be everything to make sure that they can get as much of your information about you as possible to target you for whatever they want as a government. The fact that it was sheerly so unconstitutional, but people still ran, just shows, that there's been a lot of success in dividing us as a nation, even if we all tweet together in kumbaya fashion. That, the building blocks on that. So I'd say for anyone who's asking about solidarity, especially in this age, just revisit the Huduma number narrative. The fact that it's been declared unconstitutional, the fact that they're still going, but also there's a strange solidarity Kenyans have on every step of the way, because even the refusal to go collect those cards is brilliant. There are other reasons that tie back to the data economy. For example, folks who used certain phone numbers to register, so that's how they get the notification. But because of the data lending, the money lending, digital lending, so many have switched off those numbers, so they cannot be reached. So basically, you kept the system in the loop. It's a strange form of obfuscation and solidarity in its own way. Hopefully, we can invest a lot more on having the proactive kind, because we're such a creative lot as a country. Sometimes we are just one big creative agency, to start doing these things further upstream and meet this government at its own game. I mean, they frustrated us enough. It's the least we can do. I think we can complicate the plans that they may have.
Good. Thank you so much for responding to that. So for context, I was not giving opportunity for questions because I saw most of them were answered in the chat. But I don't know if Lisa, should I take any question now, or should we? Because I think most of them have been answered, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, I think most of them have been answered.
Maurice, I don't know whether I can.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I had seen a very interesting question here about whether there's a difference between Western internet and capitalism / corporate dynamic versus China and its approach. I just wanted to throw in a couple of comments before we cap off. I think my first point is we are not living in the Cold War age anymore, right? We don't need to trade off and balance our interests where we pit, East versus West. We are no longer living in that kind of world. And it's also important to recognize that China itself has built an internet based on, in large part, censorship, intimidation, surveillance, versus what the West has built, that I guess the model that we subscribe to, where the potential of the internet is subject to the logic of capitalist domination and profit maximization. But yeah, I just don't think we should be viewing this conversation as an East versus West conversation, where if the quote unquote, what the West is offering has been shut down by our governments, then we should be turning to what the East has to offer. Yeah.
Actually, it is, but time is up. So that's your next thematic session, Maurice.
Good. You're giving me topics for the next discussion. Guys, we'll have to end it here because I would like to respect that some of our panelists and even participants have other things to do. But thank you so much, John, Nanjira, and Sigi, for coming into this conversation. We as Baraza are looking to just curate a discussion. Basically, it's not. That's why I was saying it's not panel, but we are discussing some emerging issues that need to be discussed right now. So just keep your eyes and ears on what we are doing for probably the next conversation that we'll be having. But mainly we want to focus on these sort of like quick discussions, especially around issues on policy that are affecting the industry. The industry for us being definitely media and somewhat also the creative industry. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing all the thoughts that you have. This video recording will be on YouTube, and Lisa, who's my teammate, will also just work to share it with everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll allow our panelists to log off whenever they're ready at 4 exactly. We've kept time. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.